Hello, welcome to Conversations at the Edge. I am joined here with Lama Tantrapa today. We're going to talk about how to thrive in challenging times. Lama, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Christian.
Awesome. So as we discussed, I'd love to hear about your personal journey with discovering and learning how to use Qigong and being in the flow as part of how to deal with challenges. And this goes way back for you. So tell us a little bit about your background and the lineage and, how you came to learn all you learned and how that has been applied in everyday life.
Well, growing up in the largest country in the world, back then when it was the Soviet Union, I basically had challenges because the whole country was like one big bad neighborhood. And so you had to be constantly on the lookout, not just for bullies, but for all kinds of other troubles. And I obviously had to learn how to survive under those circumstances. Now, I wasn't really trying to survive as a kid because my grandparents were relatively okay. Like my grandparents were lawyers and my parents were both PhDs in engineering. So more or less middle class, but it still was an ongoing struggle. And also, of course, my own attitude. When I was young and stupid, I was getting myself in all kinds of trouble. And my hero actually was my grandfather, who was one of the top martial artists in the country.
Well, tell us a little about him.
Well, he was a pretty impressive guy. Even when he was older, like in his 60s and even 70s, he had amazing physique. And of course, just that already was impressive for somebody like me growing up around him. And he would be just like doing all kinds of crazy physical movements and acrobatics and whatnot. But more importantly, I always thought that he had this really clear mind that kept him from getting distracted by a lot of things and also keeping priorities straight, because that's one of the things that most people have trouble with. They have distractions pulling them in different directions and their priorities are not organized. And so they waste a lot of energy. And when they waste energy, they basically feel like they're disempowered. He was a prime example of empowerment. Never angry at anyone, but very assertive. Never reactive to people, so he wouldn't get stressed out, get into fight or flight kind of mode. But he was constantly responsive and very kind, but very empowered and strong. And you can see that this is a person who you wouldn't want to fuck with in case push comes to shove. So basically, that was an impressive introduction for me into this art of being in the flow. And then I also studied with a number of other teachers and learned all kinds of different other styles of martial arts and Qigong and yoga and meditation. And also, I wasn't always into spirituality. I was exploring other things, sciences and social sciences, and got a degree in anthropology, cultural anthropology, and also studied international relations. I almost became a diplomat.
Wow.
I didn't, because the country was falling apart. I literally consciously decided I don't want to be a diplomat because the Soviet Union is no more. And so there's no country that I wanted to represent. Like Russia and Ukraine at that time, they were like really in shambles. And so I was like, there is no way I would be a diplomat. I served in the military, also was in special forces, and I was a sergeant. So experienced all kinds of issues with military service and with the war in Afghanistan and various other places. So basically had a fair share of challenges to deal with. including some near-death experiences, being shot at, blown up, kidnapped, tortured. So basically all kind of crappy things happened when I was not in the flow. But instead of perceiving them as bad things that I wished wouldn't happen, I actually learned how to recognize them as learning opportunities. And that is exactly what allows me to feel okay with my past.
Mm.
No regret, no anger, no hang-ups about the past, even though it's much more challenging than most people experience in their entire lives.
Indeed. I mean, you certainly shared a whole bunch of interesting things that you've been through. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your grandfather and the training you received with him, because from what I understand, I mean, this is a lineage that traces back to Tibet. And so that's pretty fascinating. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, so how did Tibetan arts make their way into Russia to begin with? Well, Tibet and Tibetan culture are close to Mongolian culture. The Mongolian language, the Mongolian traditions are closely related to Tibetans. And Tibetan shamanism and Mongolian shamanism were pretty much the initial spiritual beliefs or traditions that were in the Mongol Empire, which under Genghis Khan and his grandson Batu and a number of other leaders of the Mongol Empire basically were colonizing pretty much most of Eurasia.
Yeah, and they made it all the way to Eastern Europe and parts of what was Soviet Union.
They actually laid siege on Vienna, Austria, believe it or not.
I know, it's amazing.
That's amazing. So they totally kicked ass. And they had this crazy warriors that would just vanquish almost anyone on their path. How did they have this ability to overcome forces of other countries that were 10 or even 20 times larger? Well, they had not only fierce warriors, they also had fierce strategies. Yeah. And they had fierce training regimens. So basically, combined, this gives you an ability to conquer pretty much anything you want. And so what they did was they created the largest empire in the world, as far as I know. And it lasted for a long time. Like Russia was under the Mongol rule for over 300 years. Wow. Mongols also created the Yuan dynasty in China. So basically, that was such an influence that most people nowadays, or at least people living in America, may not really recognize that was a huge impact on not only Russia, but many other countries. Central Asia, Persia, even India. The Magul Empire in India was actually started by the Mongol offspring. And so what happened is that they brought with them, of course, their traditions and their training regiments. A lot of Russians were fighting against them, but some Russian families or clans actually collaborated with them. And essentially, my ancestors apparently were among those who collaborated with the Mongols, like helped them collect the taxes or what have you.
Right.
In exchange, they also got some degree of trust, so much so that some of the ancestors into my lineage inherited some of the practices that they learned from the Tibetan and Mongolian warriors. And these practices essentially integrated a lot of both spiritual, in particular shamanic practices, also healing practices, martial arts, and the ability to literally just feel okay no matter what happens in your life. You know, when you are a nomad like Mongols used to be, you have to deal with all kinds of situations, and you don't know what's going to be happening tomorrow, where you're even going to sleep overnight. And so you have to constantly be in the flow. And that kind of challenging and really intense lifestyle established a very strong requirement for learning. It's like strong motivation. You've got to learn how to be in the flow, otherwise you're going to perish.
All right.
So that's basically one of the things that got my ancestors to learn what they were studying, and they didn't perish. They survived and perpetuated that knowledge over generations. So as far as I can count, I don't know if it's a correct count, but most likely I'm the 27th generation lineage holder.
Yeah.
Some generations kind of skipped. Like, for example, my father studied with my grandpa, but he didn't become lineage holder. For him, his career as an engineer was important. For me, my career as a diplomat was just a no-go, dead on arrival, so to speak. So I was like, okay, well, I don't want to be a bodyguard. After my military service, I actually had a bodyguarding company, believe it or not.
Yep.
Before I became a Tibetan Lama, I really kicked ass. Sometimes I still do. And it basically was an opportunity for me to kind of reorient my whole lifestyle, my whole destiny, if you will, or course in life, to be less involved in some kind of a really active enforcement of what I thought was right, and instead learn more about what is really right.
So at some point, so you're saying that at some point, although you trained with your grandfather throughout your childhood and your teens, at a certain point, you actually sought out training directly from Tibetans. Is that correct?
Well, the lamas I received most of my training from actually were from Siberia. People don't know much about it, but in Russia, there are quite large swaths of land that are traditional Buddhist country, both Tibetan Buddhist and pretty much Mongolian Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism is the same Buddhism, and they call it Vajrayana.
Yep.
And so there are three main areas in Russia where Buddhism actually is practiced by the majority of population, not the Russian Orthodox Church that most people associate with life in Russia, but actually Tibetan Buddhism. And one is in Transbaikalia, and so it's east of the Baikal Lake, kind of a big, huge lake in south of Siberia, close to the border with Mongolia. Another area is west of Mongolia, also on the border with Mongolia and China, called Tuva, or the Altai region. And that's where my family comes from. And there is another area actually in the European part of Russia, just close to the Caspian Sea, called Lista. And so, Kalmykia. And so Kalmykia, Buryatia, and Tuva are three large areas or sizable areas where people actually practice this disciplines and spiritual paths.
So would these areas also correlate to the traditional Silk Road areas connecting, the Far East and the Near East in Europe?
As far as I know, the main route of the Silk Road actually went further south through Central Asia and Persia. Okay. But I'm sure there were numerous paths between East Asia and European part of the continent. And so basically, there were numerous ways to get from one part of the largest landmass in the world to the other part.
Right. I kind of recall there being one of the paths going north of Tibet. There's a very large desert somewhere around there. Okay, yeah. So that's like one of the routes. So,
and believe it or not, that actually was also one of the areas that the Greeks established a Greek colony. Believe it or not.
Wow.
When Alexander the Great went all the way to India and eventually perished on his journey, his generals became the rulers of massive empire that he created in 200 BC. And so for a number of centuries, they actually were Greek countries in Central Asia, and including that area of China north of Tibet, Taklamakan. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that they say Mahayana Buddhism got developed as a result of combination or mixture of Buddhist thought from India and Greek philosophies.
Wow, I did not know that part. That's a fascinating little tidbit there. But listening to all that you're sharing, I mean, it's amazing how these movements of cultures. I mean, certainly the Mongols, they did go very far, and as did the Greeks. Now, one of the things that was super unique with the Mongolian Empire is, although they were certainly brutal in their conquests, they were very open-minded regarding customs and religions and practices, and eager to learn from others. And as you described, when trust was built, they would share knowledge. And so it's a vast distance from Mongolia all the way to Ukraine or other parts of Europe where they managed to actually get. So that's fascinating. So when you you studied with Tibetan Buddhists in Siberia. Was that the Vajrayana tradition, or because I also know you studied the Bon tradition?
Exactly. Both the Vajrayana tradition of Tibetan Buddhism and the Bon tradition of Tibetan shamanism.
Right.
So obviously, as in most organized religions, in the case of most organized religions in Tibet, Buddhism was not the original spiritual path of the people who lived there for thousands of years. What did they do before an organized religion such as Buddhism arrived from India? Well, they were practicing shamanism. That's the most indigenous, most native, most natural spirituality known to humans, as far as I know. And obviously in Tibet, people were practicing shamanism like they did in Mongolia or Siberia or Australian Aborigines or Native American shamans. Basically, they have their own way of addressing nature and learning how to connect with nature. And so both Tibetan shamanism influenced Tibetan Buddhism, so much so that it actually became a distinct Tibetan Buddhism as compared to all other types of Buddhism out there. And in reverse, there was enough influence of Buddhism on Tibetan shamanism to actually turn it into almost an organized religion, which is kind of a unique thing. Most shamans are not particularly organized. They don't live in monasteries. They don't create orders. But in Tibetan shamanism, they actually did. They started building monasteries, not like the same kind of monasteries the Buddhist tradition has, but still, the teachers of Tibetan shamanism are referred to as lamas, which in Tibetan simply means the spiritual teacher or guide. And they receive ordinations. That's one of the ordinations that I received. I also received ordinations in Tibetan Buddhist tradition of Nyingma, as well as in Japanese tradition of Nipponzan Mihoji, and also got ordained as a bhikshu in the Thai Theravada tradition of Buddhism. So basically, I was like a spiritual whore. I've been with them all.
Well, you certainly got around. That's clear. So, and I guess you said you did some study in anthropology, which I guess then also highlights a lot of your knowledge of this cultural aspects of this, which ties in. So, with because I know that you describe the lineage as Tibetan shamanic Qigong, also sometimes referred to as Qidao. So,
Right.
So I mean, I guess with lineage holders, I mean, there is, it's a preservation of a tradition, but it's also an innovation of that tradition as you go. Each lineage holder is contributing and shaping that lineage. Because it's a living, breathing thing. It's not a fixed religion or belief system. It's an organic thing. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I really appreciate that you explain it this way, because a lot of people think that as a lineage holder, your job is to preserve things without change, just like they were done by your grandfathers and generations before him. That's how we end up with dead arts or dead sciences or dead traditions. In other words, if there is no evolution, if there is no adaptation to the new times, to the new environments, the arts basically become stagnant. And that's how they disappear. So surprisingly, keeping the art alive requires making it more adaptable, not static replica of what used to be several thousand years ago. And that's something that I personally understand. And as a lineage holder, I consider this my responsibility not to allow the art to remain the same as it was even 50 years ago.
Right.
What am I doing to make it not the same? Well, obviously, we live in very different times. I live in a very different country. And my grandfather had to change a great deal about Qidao when he was going through his ordeals in his life. Obviously, growing up in a communist regime puts you in very different conditions as opposed to living, let's say, under a Tsarist regime or under the Mongol regime or whatever. And you have to adapt, you have to flow. Hence the name, the art of being in the flow, is what we are studying. We learn how to adapt. We learn how to persevere despite all odds or all the challenges and changes that happen. But we realize change is the most constant thing in the universe.
Indeed.
Instead of struggling, we learn how to flow with it. And when you're in the flow, you experience the most profound sense of wellness and well-being. You can actually thrive instead of struggling against the flow.
So I want to kind of jump back to maybe some more examples, specific examples of challenges that you encountered. Any stories come to mind of particularly something that was really impactful and then how you responded to that and then grew from that?
Well, as I mentioned, being shot at, being blown up by landmines and other explosives, being arrested numerous times because I was also a peace activist, believe it or not. Once I got out of the military service, I said, what, screw war. And so unlike many vets who basically get indoctrinated into believing that the military is the best thing since sliced bread, I was very disappointed in the military. And despite my involvement in military service back then, I was more of a pacifist, or at least a peaceful warrior, if you will. Even during my service, one of my major components of my service was search and rescue operations. Saving lives rather than taking lives. So I constantly had to find a way to kind of balance my warrior spirit and training with recognition that I don't want to fight all the time. As a matter of fact, if you're fighting all the time, you're not in the flow. You're fighting. You're struggling. And so even when I was performing my duties as a bodyguard, and I owned a company which also hired bodyguards, we were learning how to not be in harm's way, not place our charge or our clients in harm's way either.
Right.
And sometimes even negotiate with the potential kidnappers. Like, we would actually have like, oh yeah, these guys are up to no good. We know their capabilities. Let's talk to them. Let's see how we can make it so that they know that they don't want to come after our clients because we're protecting them. And at the same time, we don't have to go to war to deter them. So basically, there's some kind of a way to navigate and dance with danger instead of just taking like a man and then wonder how come either I'm being injured or my client is dead.
Right.
It worked for a while until I got kidnapped.
Yeah, kidnapping seems to be a little bit more of a phenomena in the Soviet Union, now Russia. I've heard a lot of accounts of that. Any foreign people that live there, or business people, anyone, there's a a lot more need for bodyguards there than here.
Right. The funny thing is that my job was to be a bodyguard. I didn't have a bodyguard myself, so
Oops.
that's exactly what I needed, apparently. But that was one of the lessons. So be more aware and more prepared for the crap that may hit the fan at any moment. I was meeting with a friend. I thought he was a friend. It turned out to be a setup. And interestingly enough, it was also kind of politically motivated, because it happened right the day before I was supposed to be meeting with the Deputy Minister of Justice of Ukraine to basically complain about the local authorities in my native city refusing to register our Buddhist organization that I was organizing. So I was organizing and leading a community of people who are practicing meditation, Qigong, and martial arts. And it's always been like this for me. It kind of intrinsically connected. Meditation goes hand in hand with Qigong, and healing goes hand in hand with martial arts. There is nothing contradictory in this kind of combination from my point of view. Some people think, how is it possible to be a peaceful warrior? There is either peace or there is war. Well, things are not black and white when you become a little bit more enlightened. And so what we do is we learn how to become more enlightened. That's the primary objective. And also we learn how to do this in such a way that when you become more enlightened, you become a more functional human being.
Yeah. And
what does it mean to be more functional? You find yourself at the right place at the right time more often, doing the right thing. So if you being kidnapped, for example, that's not a sign of being in the right place at the right time, and probably not doing the right things. So that was a great lesson for me. And that's exactly what I got out of that experience. A lot of people would say kidnapping is the most terrible thing that could possibly happen to you. How can you be okay with that part of your personal history? Aren't you like traumatized? Aren't you like really angry at whoever kidnapped you? Well, first of all, they didn't give me their business cards to know even who to be angry at. But the most important thing is that having spent 3 days in the root cellar that was about a tall, so in other words, I couldn't even stand up straight. Obviously, without food or water, actually being hit with a baseball bat over my head, so a significant brain concussion.
Wow.
And I realized that I was dreaming. And I was like, I am dreaming that I'm sitting here in this silly root cellar. I wonder how I can turn this dream into a more pleasant experience than a nightmare. Most people who say that you have a nightmare when you like stuck in a tiny little cell where you cannot even stand up. Luckily, I don't have claustrophobia, right? But you might develop claustrophobia if you spend some time in a place like that. I didn't. I also done plenty of spelunking or caving, so I was kind of used to being in enclosed spaces and caves. And one of the things that I realized is that I don't have to focus on things I don't resonate with in my life. It's totally up to me what to focus on. Just like if you're a prisoner, like Nelson Mandela spent many years in prison, but he said, you have freedom in prison, not because you're free to go wherever you want, but you have freedom to focus your attention on what you choose to.
Well, let's explore that a little bit in relation to the title of this video, Thriving in Challenging Times. This year has been very challenging on many fronts for many people in a whole variety of different reasons. And of course, even for those least affected, it's such a global phenomenon. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I like to scan social media, Facebook, and I have a variety of people I'm connected with, and certainly get to see a variety of ways that people are coping with this.
Yeah.
And there are definitely some cautionary tales from my perspective in terms of like how obsessed people get with all the things they don't like. And now being, certainly scanning what's going on in the world to be aware and to know what to look out for and what to take action on it can be a very useful thing. But a lot of people, it seem to get a little bit addicted, if you will, to the drama of, I hate this, I hate that person, now that's one part of it. The other part is, there are a lot of people who have been affected either directly by the pandemic in terms of their health or loss of income. It's pretty serious, the impact. So in the context of what everyone has been going through this last year, how would you see applying those principles to this scenario?
Just like you can apply these principles to virtually any aspect of your life. You can apply it to the situation that you find yourself in now during this pandemic. It's just one of many things that can happen in life. If we get really flustered or frustrated, angry, or confused, it creates a degree of suffering. And most of this suffering actually is self-imposed or self-inflicted suffering. In other words, we can experience health issues, we can experience pain, we can experience discomfort of not being able to go wherever we want to go. We may experience discomfort for wearing a mask. All kinds of things can happen like this. But when we tell ourselves the story that this is wrong, this is bad, how dare those people tell me this, or this is really screwed up that this is happening, we add insult to injury. So not only are we experiencing the discomfort or a lack of freedom to some extent, we actually cause ourselves more pain and suffering by constantly repeating to ourselves that this is wrong, this is bad, and focusing attention on that part of the dream that you particularly don't resonate with. Guess what? It's the royal road to turning this dream into a nightmare. So that you are basically turning this dream that we live in 2020 into a nightmare. And that's what most people, or a lot of people, seem to think, that 2020 has been like a nightmare. They say, I can't wait to see it with 2020 vision in the rearview mirror. They say that hindsight vision is 2020. Oh, I can't wait to have it in hindsight. I know people who actually did not suffer in 2020. Not because nothing challenged them, but because they actually recognize that suffering is optional.
So let's talk about that for a second. So kind of just backtracking to what you were saying about, let me see if I understand you correctly. So essentially, there are the things that are happening, and that could be you've gotten sick, or someone you know has gotten sick, you maybe lost your work or income. So there's certainly things that are directly happening, but it seems like what you're describing is that the layer of suffering on top of that is kind of what is the narrative storyline that we of how we interpret it. So certainly, things can happen that are unpleasant. Things can happen, for those who have families that they, if you're the breadwinner and you lose work, or like it's certainly very serious. Like, how do you respond? So I don't want to make light of people who have gotten sick or people who have died or lost their income. That in of itself is a serious circumstance, but how you respond to it and what narrative you overlay on that is the thing that makes the difference.
Absolutely. That's the operative word, respond.
Yeah.
What's the alternative? Most people react rather than responding to challenges.
Mm-hmm.
What's the reaction? Well, reaction is acting against the oncoming force. For example, political reaction. There's been plenty of that happening in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
What form does it take? It takes form of acting against someone or something. They are bad people. They are wrong. They are stupid. They are downright evil. And so acting against them seems justified, and that only adds more to the conflict. So basically, well, that's how we wage wars.
Mm-hmm.
We escalate conflicts. How do you escalate conflict? Just go against the flow. That's
right.
the surefire way to turn the conflict into warfare. What do we know instead? We know how to respond instead of reacting to whatever is going on. How do we respond to that? Well, first we realize that we don't have to have a knee-jerk reaction. Instead of reactivity, that basically says whatever change is happening is bad, is wrong, it shouldn't be happening. We change our mind. We realize, okay, interesting, there's a change happening. Where is it going? How can I be in the flow of this change instead of trying to prevent this change from happening? How can I catch this wave and surf this wave, so to speak? I think surfing is an awesome metaphor of being in the flow, because that's exactly what happens when you surf. And when you stop struggling against the waves, then you have a chance to actually catch up the wave, catch a wave and ride it. And it's not going to be a steady ride. You are constantly sliding down, falling, sliding down the slope of the wave. But you're maintaining dynamic balance. You're constantly regaining balance, even though you're falling or sliding. And well, that's what we do in our daily lives. We learn how to recognize the changes happening. Let's observe first. Let's pay attention instead of intention. I don't want to say intention is bad, but instead of immediately having an intention or a certain assumption that this is wrong, this is how it should be instead, we actually develop the quality of attention that most people lack in their lives. Well, hence the pandemic of attention deficit disorder happening parallel to all kinds of other things happening. So what does it mean? It means we develop attentiveness. And as we have this quality of consciousness, then we can bring our attention to wherever we choose. Exercising this freedom of choice makes people happy. The more you exercise your freedom of choice, by and large, the happier you feel. So this is the golden key to kingdom. Basically, the door is not even locked. You don't even need the key, really. The idea that we have the freedom at every single second. We have the ability to make choices based on much more intelligent way of thinking and decision making than what most people use. Most people use a very black and white way of looking at things and judging things as either good or bad.
Right, because essentially people get locked into one of the central ideas that you have introduced several times is they don't want something to be happening. Like, this shouldn't be happening. So clearly it is happening, but then there's the people get stuck on, I don't want this to be happening, this shouldn't be happening. And that puts us in a position of not having any choices. Now, even though we may not have the choice around whether something has happened, we still have a choice around how we respond to it, what narrative we assign it, what meaning we assign it. So it's an inner freedom that, you know, may or may not translate into an external freedom right away. But if we deny,
it translates into lack of stress, because when you have that level of internal freedom, and you're not judgmental, and you're not perceiving things in a black and white fashion that things are either good or bad, you replace it with much more intelligent way of relating to things based on energy resonance. What you resonate with is authentic to you because it's your energy resonating with whatever it is that you're focusing attention on. And nobody is going to tell you, you shouldn't resonate with this, you should resonate with this.
Right.
Who knows, really? And another thing is, it's also subject to change because you are not going to be the same tomorrow. And so as you are changing, your predilections also will change, or your energy alignments and resonance will change too. And so you constantly learn how to adapt and how to be in the flow of change. Being able to make decisions based on energy resonance, even in such small, seemingly insignificant instances. Like, for example, thoughts about what's going to happen tomorrow or next year. The end of the year is coming, time to develop New Year's resolutions. Mm-hmm. Probably a few people start thinking about, well, what do I want 2021 to be like? Probably not the way that 2020 was. Who wants 2021 to be like 2020?
Maybe some people.
Oh yeah, Elon Musk certainly does, because his work and his business just skyrocketed this year, and several other people. And I know people who actually thrive in this kind of challenging times, not because they are, investing when the blood is in the streets, as one of the stereotypes of smart investment goes, but also because they stop reacting to things. So, for example, for me, 2020 was not a bad year. Personally, I was actually quite satisfied with the way 2020 went for me. And at the same time, of course, there were challenges. Would I want my life to be free of challenges? No, because you cannot learn anything if you don't have any challenges. You just need to have the learning state of consciousness, the beginner's mind, that switches the perception. So instead of perceiving things as problems, you perceive them as learning opportunities as quickly as humanly possible. And when you are in that learning state of consciousness, you're not struggling against what you're observing or watching. You are learning from it. If you're struggling against the learning experience, it's like, you go to college and pick up a fight with a professor, for example. Well, how well will you learn whatever professor is teaching in that lecture? You're not going to learn much from that professor who you're fighting.
Right.
We also learn how to stop struggling against the lessons and recognize them as such. And when we recognize the lessons, we become grateful for having this profound learning opportunity that allows us to grow and become stronger and wiser.
So it seems like one of the keys that comes up again and again is by not struggling against what is happening, we can stay in a more relaxed state, and being in a more relaxed state has a whole host of benefits. Of course, a lot of people are chronically stressed, and it certainly affects health. And a curious thing in a scenario like we have right now, in a world where we're so connected, is something that I think it's called the Nocebo Effect. The opposite of the placebo, that people have such an expectation of fear of getting sick. They're being told how dangerous everything is. Now, not to negate actual danger, I'm talking here about the effect it has on our brain and our system when we're expecting bad things. I've heard actually studies done on the nocebo effect, whereby if a doctor gives someone a diagnosis of 6 months, they're more likely to die within 6 months than if they were not given that diagnosis, having the exact same issue. So certainly, you talked earlier a little bit about the dream, right? And I know that from this lineage, and going back to the Bon tradition, the dream yoga, very much by approaching life as a dream, it seems to create more flexibility around what life is. So instead of it just being this black and white, either scientific approach or a culturally agreed upon approach, you're actually allowing your experience to be full of possibility, like a dream. Tell us a little bit more about that dreaming state in the waking dream, if you will, and also how staying in a more relaxed state helps you respond better to life and have more possibilities.
Yeah, this is a really important correlation or a parallel that you just made between being awake in the dream and being more responsive and relaxed in daily life. And in a sense, we learn how to take certain steps to develop this level of lucidity in our daily lives. I'm talking about lucidity that most people associate with being in lucid dreams, which are dreams in which you recognize that you're dreaming.
Right.
Well, often people report that once they have a lucid dream, they say, it's amazing. I have never been so awake, including my entire daily life. What does it mean? It means that we think that we are awake when we wake up in the morning and get out of bed, but often we are still constantly dreaming. What does it mean? Well, in English, I really like the fact that the same word, dreaming, applies not only to dreams at night, but also daydreams. And pretty much any type of thought about the past is the realm of daydreaming. You're recalling something, your memory, traveling down the memory lane, so to speak. You are daydreaming about something that is no longer happening. It happened sometime in the past, maybe a long time, maybe not so long time ago, but it's obviously a form of a daydream. How often do we recognize that when we are involved in this type of reverie or recollection, we are actually daydreaming? Most people don't recognize that. And so they often focus on things that they don't resonate with in that dream. In other words, everything is made of energy in dreams. And focusing on something energetic that you don't resonate with is essentially going against the flow. How do you know that you resonate with something? It's easy to keep going in that direction, or it's easy to focus your attention on something that you resonate with. For example, listening to music that you really love. You can probably listen to it for hours and don't get tired and don't notice how the time passes, as opposed to listening to some piece of music that you really can't stand.
Oh, I'd
start cringing and can't wait to turn it off.
I'd love to explore something around that what you just said about when there's that resonance, things you're drawn to it more easily. There's more flow. How would you say then that? How would this relate to when there is any form of addiction? And certainly, addiction is on a very wide kind of spectrum, ranging from the common addictions to social media or checking our phone, or simply following whatever habits we have in life. Now, when certain things like ranging from habits to addictions or very, very serious addictions, certainly we it might feel very hard to change that pattern. So how does that relate to the resonance? Because you may want to do something new, and because of this habit and pattern, it's not going to feel easy. It's not going to feel in the flow to actually go in this new direction. So tell us a little bit about that.
That's a really interesting question. In a sense, you can say, well, there are neural pathways in the brain. And thanks to brain plasticity, they can be rerouted. As a matter of fact, people who are genius or who are highly functional human beings have brain plasticity at a higher level than those who are stuck in the rut or in the perspective. people who are open-minded, people who have greater ability to adopt or to change, basically use their brain more. Now, what does it mean? It means that if we are addicted to a particular pattern of behavior or substance or something else, even thought forms, it means that we follow the same route from one neuron to the next neuron to the next neuron along certain maze of this neural pathways. And each time we take this specific trail following this pathway across the brain, so to speak, those neurons that keep firing over and over and over again, that they essentially get used to doing that. And they even reward you for taking this well-established trail. If you go in some direction that you're not familiar with, there's going to be some discontent, some discomfort when you experience something new. And if the degree of discomfort is greater than the motivation to explore what is possible in that direction, you will turn around and go back down the path that you're more used to. Now, I don't want to say that the path of least resistance is always good. I don't want to say that it's always bad. I always prefer to experiment. And experimentation means you are going to experience new things. You are going to explore things. And as an explorer, in this case, we're talking about inner explorations. Mm-hmm. You are going to experience new pathways, some of which are going to feel great, better than whatever experiences you had before. Some pathways may turn out into dead ends and you will decide not to pursue them. Mm-hmm. But you are not stuck. You are constantly learning new things. And this ability to create pathways that are multidimensional, that go into a variety of different directions and give you greater variety of choices, basically, as I mentioned, lead to greater happiness. Mm. When a person is addicted to something, by and large, we say this is an addiction, not a good habit. Why? Because it has some deleterious connotations or negative effect on us. What kind of negative effect do we usually get? Well, even if we don't ruin our lives by drugs or alcohol or other things that most people know about as an addictive substances, like you mentioned, people can also get addicted to, let's say, social media. Mm-hmm. What kind of addiction is that? Well, basically, they feel incomplete or uncomfortable by themselves, or they're lonely and they don't feel comfortable in their company, in their own company. So what do they do instead? They seek some degree of dopamine response or confirmation that I'm doing something that I like and I get rewarded for that. In other words, that forms a habit, and eventually habit becomes an addiction. If we realize that, oh yeah, I am addicted. I am doing this incessantly, don't I? Well, that's the first step in the path of recovery, as they say, right? So that basically already become a little bit more lucid. You realize, yeah, I am doing something that I may consider not beneficial for me for some reason. So this already gives you a little bit of a fly in a wall perspective, or ability to kind of see yourself from a different point of view and realize, oh, this may be not the most functional way to be. Now, that's where we start looking for what would be a more functional way to be, instead of just being hard on ourselves that I'm so stupid, how could I get addicted to this crap? We actually start exploring what better way to be is available.
And also,
there's going to be.
Would this also not be? This kind of seems like it comes back to the balance between attention and intention, because, you know, attention seems to me like attention can be kind of a little bit of an unconscious attention, as in, yes, you're going about your life, you're doing your thing, but there can be an element of unconscious habits just kind of playing out. And certainly we can be, what you described earlier of like, there can be this moment of awareness of, oh, wait, I'm doing this thing again and again, and it's causing this harm, or it's not getting the results that I want. Now, it seems like then we can veer over to using our intention, like, okay, I've got this habit in place, it's creating results I don't want, and now you decide, I'm going to try something different. So that's an element of intention.
And then you go back to attention, because that is what you constantly practice to exercise. Most people don't really need to exercise their intention as much as they think. Like, it's a big buzzword nowadays. I know, I live intentionally. What's your intention for the next year? Blah, blah, blah. Intentions are always laced with expectations.
Right.
Because who would create an intention of something that we don't think is going to be better for us than what is? But that immediately includes some degree of rejection of what is, and an assumption of something that we want to be better than what is. And guess what? Life just never meets expectations by default.
No. But how does this
disappointment and failure?
Yeah, and how does this set up? How does this relate into creativity? Because in all myriad forms of creativity, essentially, we're bringing into existence something that isn't currently, right? So that gets into a little gray area where we're literally sitting with, I don't know, a blank sheet of paper, and then we're going to write a poem. So we're not sitting with what is, we're actually sitting with what isn't yet there.
Well, this is a really important aspect of dream yoga, creativity. When we're dreaming, we're creating a whole world, a dream world, full of dream characters, including ourselves. We ourselves also are a dream character in some kind of a dream drama. And everything in the dream world is created by our own dreaming consciousness. Not just who we think we are. Obviously, we're not doing it consciously. We are doing it unconsciously. That deeper part of ourselves, the deeper part of the iceberg, so to speak, is a lot bigger than the conscious mind or who we think we are. So everything that we know about ourselves and our lives can be compared to a tiny tip of the iceberg. Is compared to a huge part of the iceberg that's underwater and is unknown. What we do is we develop a clear interface, or at least start clearing that interface, the window between the tip of the iceberg and the rest of it. And what is that interface that allows to peer into the unknown and make it?
Well, it seems like that would be awareness.
Exactly. That is exactly it. Awareness is the capacity to bring that which used to be unknown into the realm of known. How do we develop awareness? We do it by learning how to be attentive. In other words, attention is a prerequisite for awareness. It's really hard to focus your attention, to focus your awareness on something if you're not paying attention. So basically, that's why attention is so important, and it cannot be overemphasized that we need to be more and more attentive, and we start by actually paying attention to ourselves. Because where attention goes, energy flows. When you pay attention to yourself, where does energy flow?
To yourself.
Yeah. Yes, it starts circulating in your system. It starts flowing. And that massive circulation of energy, the flow in your system, is very empowering. That's the secret behind macrocosmic orbit and similar types of practices. It's not just running it up and down, do my and around my. It's actually allowing the energy to find where it needs to flow, trusting that it knows where to flow, exercising a little bit less intention and a little bit more attention, because we don't really want to intend the energy to do this thing or to go this way, because it flows where the laws of nature tell it to flow, and we know only very little about these laws of nature.
Right.
So
And
most of the reasons why energy flows one way or another are not known to us, but we can trust that it's going to flow where it needs to.
so it seems like maybe the most important thing is to not get in the way of what is already working very well.
And actually learn how to surf these waves or these currents, or how to be in the flow. In other words, being in the flow doesn't mean that you just completely surrender and do nothing about it. There is a degree of surrender, of course, but you may also exercise some degree of intention. So I don't want to say that intention is bad and should be tossed away, because you would be tossing the baby with the bathwater doing that. You need to find a important balance or combination or sweet spot between intention and attention. And we actually exercise both of these qualities. And that is what gives you creativity, because you realize that who's creating your dream? Well, you are creating a dream. It's just the resource within you that is deep in that underwater part of the iceberg, from where the dream rises to the surface and you become aware of it. Let's connect with a deeper source of creativity. That's one of the reasons why we study dream yoga, is so that we actually become a lot more creative in our lives. And as you do that, you start feeling like, wow, I am the captain of my ship. I am creating my own destiny. But I'm not doing it like a chess player, figuring out how to make this strategy, like go from point A to point B perfectly. You kind of get the idea, and then you also constantly adapt, because there's going to be changes when you go from point A to point B. And you may not go straight as crow flies, you may actually navigate somehow. And that is exactly where attention and intention have to be in balance.
Okay, so it's like a constant thing. And I think I've heard from I've never surfed myself, but I've heard that there's this kind of very precarious balance between enough muscular tension to like hold yourself on the board, but if you're too stiff, you'll fall off if you're too stiff, and you'll fall off if you're too loose. So there's like a very good sweet spot, and certainly that's a beautiful art in terms of the balance between attention and intention, because on the one hand, you're riding the wave of this literal wave under you, which is supplying the energy for that momentum. Yet you have some intention with, if I lean a little here, I lean a little there, I can ride it in a certain way. So it's interactive between you and the wave. So the wave is not just doing its thing to you, and you're not making it do a particular thing, but it's interactive. And it seems like what you're describing in dream yoga is a similar thing, where I think anyone who has delved into creativity, at a certain point you have this realization of, where are these ideas coming from that are coming to me? Like when I get an idea and I'm writing, it's happening, and there is an interactive thing going on where you can move this way, you can choose that word or not that word, but where ideas come from when you really dive deep is pretty mysterious. It's coming from somewhere, but it's not like you can actually pinpoint. And certainly many people who say, for example, people who write songs, sometimes they're like, I don't know where that came from, and this is like boom, and I like in 30 minutes later I had this amazing song. It's certainly not a clear scientific method of how to do that, although maybe some very terrible pop songwriters do have a formula, which of course is a testimony to how repetitive it is. But like true fresh creativity is mysterious.
You're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, there are quite a few folks I interviewed over the years who are experts in both creativity and research on flow states. So like Michael Gelb, for example, is a well-known author and researcher of creativity, and he wrote books like thinking how to think like Leonardo da Vinci or something like that. I don't remember the title exactly, but um, basically tapping into exactly that type of resource within ourselves is possible, and in fact a lot easier if you're in a flow. It happens almost spontaneously. It's not like you're just deciding, okay, now let's tap into the creativity and crank something up. It's more like you get into the flow, and then you let that creative juices to reflect themselves or manifest themselves in art or in music or in some other endeavors that require creativity. And there are several researchers on flow that I interviewed for my talk show as well. Like actually, the father of this term, Dr. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi,
Yeah.
who wrote the book The Flow and several other books on the subject. I interviewed him, and him and I talked about how much that state of flow is found when there are challenges, but the challenges are not unsurmountable. So you kind of find that sweet spot. Again, we're talking about balance between overwhelm and underwhelm. You are kind of on the edge of your comfort zone, so you're not particularly comfortable, which means you're not bored, you're not underwhelmed, you are motivated to pay attention. Mm-hmm. But you're not overwhelmed, or in other words, your skill set or your abilities match the requirements of the moment. And you are constantly exploring what it's like to be on this edge of the comfort zone. Mindfulness about the edge is one of the key principles that I teach and practice. And developing the ability to consciously find your edges and explore them does several cool things. Well, first of all, you find where your flow is, and the more you practice it, the more it becomes a habit. It's almost like the same process of developing addictions, but now it's an addiction that actually is very beneficial. It's very addictive, if you will, to be in the flow, because that kind of creates the state of bliss and confidence and enjoyment and satisfaction. And at the same time, you're not too satisfied, so you're not lackadaisical or just unmotivated. So there is a certain degree of challenge that is still there that you constantly have to pay attention to and navigate. But the more time you spend on the edge of the comfort zone, the more comfortable you become on that edge. In other words, your comfort zone actually naturally expands. It's almost like you're eroding that edge like a river erodes the banks. And the more time you spend on the edge of the comfort zone, the more you feel like, okay, well, this is kind of comfortable now. Where's my new edge? And so you continue finding your new edges, and it's not causing yourself harm. So you're not throwing yourself over the edge into discomfort and pain, but you're not running away from discomfort either. So you're kind of developing that attitude of responding rather than reacting to challenges.
Right. So essentially, you actually have to, if challenges are not arising naturally, which they quite frequently do, but if you're wanting to really deliberately develop that neuroplasticity and having more flexibility and more options, you have to seek out challenges that are outside of what you normally do, or you're just going to kind of be in the same kind of groove and not have as many available options. I mean, looking back at this year, for those who had a lot of people's, livelihoods were upended, their abilities to travel and a lot of things were upended. And certainly that's upsetting, and it's a sudden shock. Like, oh, we can't go places. I can't do my work. Yet it is a potent time of opportunity to do things in a new way. And if we haven't been in a habit of responding to opportunity or seeing challenge as an opportunity, then we're more likely to get stuck and freeze, and then have more of a fear response, a stress response, and of course, or overreacting. So either a reactive, which is more of an outward, or a restrictive response. But looking at all of what's happened this year, certainly a lot of people have been very stuck, and things are still constrictive. Yet there's always some way of finding a way around that, and so this, what you're describing is ways of doing that. So I'd like to kind of tie things up a little bit here. Thank you for talking on this topic of how to thrive in challenging times. Thank you for telling me and our viewers about some of your history, some of your challenges, and how you've responded. I'd love to have you tell people a little bit about what's coming up in the beginning of January. There's a gathering of a lot of Qigong masters. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Well, Qigong masters or teachers of Qigong and Tai Chi and yoga and meditation and similar disciplines obviously ended up struggling a lot, because once the pandemic caused the shutdown of all gatherings, obviously they couldn't teach any classes. They couldn't teach workshops or seminars. They couldn't travel to the retreats. I obviously had to close down a lot of my classes and cancel the workshops and cancel the retreats. So I know exactly what it feels like to be in that situation. Unlike most teachers who experience significant setbacks, I actually realized that, well, I have been doing something that is perfectly suitable and applicable to this exact situation. 15 years ago, I started doing Qigong coaching. I pioneered this whole profession of Qigong coaching, as you know. And most of my coaching clients and students meet with me virtually because they live all over the world. And so I've been already doing this work online with many of them, with a vast majority of my students, about 90% of them, scattered all over the world. So that's how we've been already doing our work. It just became imperative that 100% of it needs to be done that way or close to that. And while I was switching from 90 to 100%, for most of the practitioners in our fields, it was a massive challenge because they had never done it. They were not comfortable with technology. They were not familiar with online marketing. They were not okay with even teaching people online. They were thinking that, well, this is not going to work. Who's going to become a Qigong expert if they just take some online classes or talk to you on Skype? Well, that's the difference between teaching Qigong and coaching. So coaching acts very well, unlike teaching about inviting the person to discover for themselves what they resonate with and learn the principles rather than techniques that they can start implementing right away, and not only in the context of their movements or meditation practices, but in the context of their daily life. And that means you can actually work with people virtually anywhere. Now, for me, it was a relatively easy transition. And so when I talk to other practitioners in my field, and I know a lot of practitioners because I interviewed many of them on my talk show, and they said that they were not doing so well. So I helped, for example, Bill Douglas, the founder of World Tai Chi and Qigong Day, organize a virtual way of celebrating the World Tai Chi and Qigong Day, which had never been done before in this way. We had a very successful event. About 4,000 people participated, all simultaneously at the same time, and it was like really amazing. We had just a dozen of Qigong and Tai Chi teachers come together and practice and share their knowledge and celebrate, and also had discussions, like panel discussions between them, which was very unusual. And so some of the folks who were leaders in this community also start noticing, like, well, this may be the way of the future. So, for example, I talked to Dr. Olivia Cohn, who had organized many Taoist conferences. And the Taoist conference was supposed to be happening in Bulgaria this year. Obviously, had to get canceled because nobody is going to be traveling. So I said, well, how about we create a virtual conference? And, I have expertise how to organize virtual events, and I've done several online summits. And she said, that sounds great. So we started working on that. And then I also talked to Dr. Effie Chow, who had organized 20 world congresses on Qigong. And she said, well, that sounds like a good idea. And so why don't we combine the Taoist conference with the Qigong conference into one event that basically brings the best of both worlds, so to speak? Sometimes you can tell apart the Taoist from a Qigong teacher or a Taoist practitioner from practitioner of Qigong. So we literally brought those two conferences together and organized the World Congress on Qigong and Taoism and Tai Chi the first week of January 2021. So literally starting on the first of the year, we're going to ring in the new year with a celebration, with a nice opening ceremony, and with a number of keynote presentations from one of the highly respected experts in our fields.
Wonderful.
For a whole 5 days afterwards, we will have 30 masters of Qigong and Tai Chi and Taoism and Oriental medicine, also sharing their expertise and knowledge. And the ones that I particularly handpicked as presenters were the ones who are thriving in these circumstances, despite all the odds. So they're going to be sharing how they're thriving. What are the ways that allows them to thrive in this current pandemic? And what are the principles that others can learn so that they can implement these strategies for thriving to make their life a higher quality? And so
Wonderful.
That's the theme of this Congress, the art and science of thriving in interesting times.
Well, it's sorely needed, and so I understand this is a free event. So I'm going to be posting a link to sign up for that free event. So you said there's about 30 presenters over 7 days, right. And I also understand that each of these teachers will be offering various programs at discounts, and so there's opportunities for learning and finding that where you resonate with, whether it's the Qigong or the Taoist or the Chinese medicine.
Right. There will be several days. Each day they will have a specific topic. So there will be a day dedicated to scientific research on Qigong. There's a day dedicated to policies and legal issues related to TCM, traditional Chinese medicine. There's going to be a day dedicated to finding novel financial resources for Tai Chi and Qigong teachers, and so on and so forth. So basically, there's going to be an amazing gathering of people who know some things that most people don't, and they're willing to share. In other words, they're not just thriving, but keeping this highly guarded secret of how to thrive so nobody else learns. Instead, they realize that all boats rise when the tide comes up. So basically, we all can experience thriving better together. And it's more fun to live in a thriving community. And so that's exactly why we're doing this as a free event. I personally invested a lot of time and money into it. There's going to be some return on investment, I hope, but we are offering it as a free opportunity for people to learn from the most impressive roster of presenters we've ever put together.
Wow.
10,000 people or more to attend this event. So it's going to be an amazing movement that we are organizing and setting into motion.
Well, thank you, Lama, for sharing your personal story, and we certainly went on a nice long journey in a whole variety of ways. Thank you. And so, like I said, I will be posting the link to this 7-day free event, the 20th Qigong World Congress. And so anyone who's interested, please click the link and you can find out more about it there. So thank you, Lama, very much for your time. And I guess we'll be seeing you again soon.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
Take
Christian.
care. Okay. Have a great evening.